Well, we have a lot of great questions already. And if anybody else has questions, go ahead and post them in the chat there. But I'm going to lead off with a question from Ken, Venki. And Ken asks, if there's a drought in one place, does there have to be a corresponding flood somewhere else to balance out the total world water budget?
Interesting question. Yes, but the timing might be different, because if you look at atmosphere, we tend to take Earth as a closed system. We say the amount of water in the Earth roughly stays the same, right? So, but the timing that, you have a drought here and a flood here, and then the synchronous doesn't happen, because it still takes some time for water to move from one place to another globally, and that's affected by a lot of different factors. So typically you will see that, but again, it's complicated thermodynamics which drives when that happens. But over the large term, if you look historically, yes, the answer is yes.
Okay. And then kind of a second version of this is, if you had 100-gallon tank of water in Lubbock and you let it all evaporate, is there any way of knowing how much of that would fall locally versus how much would be evicted to somewhere else?
Right. So that is what the recycle ratio tells us. So that's estimated to be anywhere between 5 to 15% on the long run. Okay. So some years, depending on whether we are more dry or atmospheric conditions, that may be high, that may be about 25, 30%. But generally speaking, irrigation gives back some water, but it gives you a lot more water to places like Arkansas, east of us, because that's where most of our water goes. So, of course, 100 gallons. I'm taking the question to be just 100 gallons evaporation will do not much to the atmosphere, but
right. It's a nice round number.
Right.
Okay, so here's a question from Yannick. He says, how was the Ogallala Reservoir initially filled?
Oh, interesting question. So Ogallala is an old aquifer. So rainfall over many million years percolated, and filled up that aquifer. There's actually an aquifer below that called the Dockham Aquifer. And that aquifer has some water from the time when the sea was actually here, so when the ocean was way up into us, right underneath us, some of that water is still trapped in there. But Ogallala, by and large, is filled by just rainfall percolating over millions of years. That's why I call it the grandma's inheritance. We got it from our past generation. We got to leave some for our future generation. So.
That's good. Well, and that feeds right into our next question, which is, what can a broke college student do to help with water conservation?
Well, this is a question I ask in my classes, and a lot of people, I just ask them, how much water do you use per day? Okay. And most of the students who are studying water resources have a hard time having an idea of what that water is. And I think the first thing people need to understand is how much water they use. Where does that water go? And it's a very simple budget, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, Mm-hmm. But if you say, I'm going to take a shower for 15 minutes, this is take a bucket and try, okay, how long, this is how much gallon comes per minute. So 15 minutes, this much water went down the drain. How much typically a toilet flush costs, how much the water is. So roughly you can figure out how much water you're using, and then think of, where can I cut that water? And if you go through and see how much water we use every day, you will automatically start thinking, what are the places where I can cut it? And that doesn't happen because we as a country believe that if the tap opens, the water has to come. And if we take that for granted, we can never change conservation. It's only when you know how much you're spending will you say, oh, I'm not going to spend that much here or here, right? So if you have an unlimited amount of money, you keep spending it. So it's the same thing with water.
Yeah, it's true. They've showed that if you put an energy meter on your house,
right,
just the simple act of observing how much electricity you're using makes people conserve electricity. Nothing else, just observing it.
Right.
So maybe we need our water meters actually in our houses.
I think was it Cal Poly students? I can look up and send you the link, Catherine, that you can share. They've done a small meter that actually goes on your house, and then there is an app that goes with it. So it kind of tells you how much water you're using per day. So like, so you can look at it right after a shower, or like, after watering your lawn or something like that. So you kind of get a good budget of where, not only how much water you're using, but where you're using the different, where the water is being used. And then that really helps. Like, so there are places that there are things like that. And I think it's like less than $100 or $200 or something like that. So it's not very expensive.
Cool. Yeah. So if you don't mind, Mackenzie, if you don't mind doing a bit of Googling. So you said it was some Cal Poly students and it was
Cal Poly students did it. I don't remember the name, but I have it somewhere. So
okay. Well, Mackenzie, if you find it, if you could post in the chat, that would be really cool.
It actually straps on to your water that comes into your house, like, right where your meter is. And then, but it has an app associated with it, which makes it,
oh yeah,
you can see on your phone,
Oh yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. And you could be sitting there when somebody else is taking a shower and you'd be like, yes, that was 85 gallons of water.
Right. And actually cities are going, like, we can't look at that data, but Wolford, for example, has automated meters everywhere. Very easy to do it in Wolford because it's a fairly new community and a smaller community. Hard to do it in a place like Lubbock, but you can actually go to City of Wolford's office and they will, if you are a Wolford resident, they will tell you where you use the water, when you use the water, how much was used during what period of time. They have track of, like, all the 4,000 connections that they have. Amazing amount of data, of course. It's all it's not public. It's,
because they know when you take a shower.
Right. This 30 by 30 app, does that sound familiar? Is that the one?
Yeah, that's about, I think. Yeah, I think that's what it is. Yeah.
Okay, so good. If you don't mind posting that in the comments, and we have a lot more questions, Venki. So let's keep on going. Sure. Okay. So Tony has a question. He said, how long would it take the Ogallala aquifer to replenish to 1970s levels if we stopped pumping? But then also you mentioned that there's policies. So what has been done policy-wise to encourage farmers and ranchers to conserve water? So two a bit different questions. So first of all, how long would it take it to recharge?
Oh, some places 100+ years. I showed you that graph, right? Like, so for a parcel of water to just go down takes about 100 years. So what's important to realize is if I pump water at a well, right, I'm depressing that water table because of my pumping, like, and I'm locally pulling that water down, okay? So that water is at a lower level than the surrounding water. So the water comes to that well, but that doesn't mean that I'm recharging Ogallala.
Right.
It just means that I'm in the lower part of the hill now because I just pumped that water. And then here there is more water, so it'll just flow towards the well. Of course, as the water flows here, the water will decline. So net, there is a decline of water table. So just because the water comes back up in a well after pumping doesn't mean that it's recharging. It just means that there is just water flowing from neighboring areas, so you're just stealing from your neighbor and getting water, not stealing, but the water is moving naturally, like, right, So many counties actually regulate that way. They say you can pump what you want in your area, but you shouldn't cause harm to you shouldn't cause any harm to your neighbors, like, and that's one way to say you can only use the water that's underneath your land. You can't be pulling too much water from elsewhere. In terms of policies, there are a couple of things that have happened. One is the farmers were typically given 2 acre-feet of water per year, per every acre that they had. 1 acre-foot is almost like a football field with 1 foot of water on top of it. So think of Jones Auditorium with a foot of water. I think it happened once.
It did.
It did. Yeah, that's an acre-foot of water, just roughly. And that acre-foot of water takes about, so they went from 2 to 1.5, and then they also did something. They said that you can use that on a 5-year rolling basis. So if you don't need the water this year, you don't lose it. You can bank it. And that has made it a little bit more efficient. And, my colleagues in Kastner, Chuck West leads the Texas Water Conservation Program. They're doing a lot of field studies to show that you can put new types of like, drip irrigation and other things. It's very difficult for farmers to make that change because economics drives it, like, because a lot of row crops are not very profitable. But also simple things like saying, you do deficit irrigation. So do about like 70%, put 70% of the water instead of 100% of water, and you'll only lose like 5% of your yield. And as a matter of fact, I've done some risk studies, and essentially, regardless of the climate, if you put about 80% of what's required for cotton crop, you will get about 95+% of your yield. Like, there is, doesn't matter. You have to forget about climate. Like, so of course, you can increase that based on your climate. Like, and if you're going to have a wet year, you can cut it down even more, and then work with that way. So there are ways in which farmers are thinking about doing it, and the farmers are doing. A lot of farmers do it. It's not that we generally can't sweep farmers with a broad brushstroke and say everybody doesn't conserve water or they're all going to use the water, because it's economics. And same thing with the industry. Like, when 2011 drought happened, fracking industry looked very hard to reuse their water that they were producing, primarily because was money. Water was expensive, and getting water was very difficult. So economics is a big driver, and having flexibility in terms of how you manage water really helps. But there needs to be some broad policies and good level of monitoring that needs to happen. And in many parts of the world, there's absolutely no groundwater monitoring. And that is really challenging. And when I was a grad student, 20+ years ago, there were no autologgers. If I had to find a pressure transducer to find daily measurements or even weekly measurements, I would spend a fortune. The grant would probably be gone, and everything in my supplies would be gone. And now they're like $500 a piece or $300 a piece. So they've gotten much cheaper, and that has really helped. And that was the biggest challenge with groundwater. We just don't have data, but that's changing quite a bit. And there are other indirect ways in which we are trying to increase data. GRACE satellites, for example, the work I showed in India is based out of GRACE satellites. Using GRACE satellites, we've used that here in High Plains to monitor and see how does GRACE satellite data work with some of the assets that we have, and it shows very strong correlation. So there are other ways in which we can look at. Streams are a really good place, but very unfortunately, our water tables are so deep that we don't have any connection anymore. Like, as a matter of fact, I was tempted to show that stream and groundwater connections, and right after 1960, it just goes flat because we started pumping water. For 10 years, we pumped water, and we lost all connections to our stream. So we no longer call them creeks or streams, we call them Droughts, just because it only gets water when there's rain.
Right.
So those, but there are policies and there are things that farmers are doing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it is balancing that long term versus the short term. That's the key to managing groundwater. And we can't lose sight of the long-term implications of groundwater while we are in the middle of a drought, for example.
Yes. So I think that this plays right into a great comment that Chuck had. And Chuck said that when the High Plains Water District, which is the one that we're in here in our part of West Texas, when the High Plains Water District mandated installation of meters on irrigation wells, many farmers finally, for the first time, saw how much water they were using, and they were much more motivated to conserve. So the simple act of knowing how much water you use actually helps you conserve.
Yes, absolutely. And that goes back to that water budgeting I was saying that everybody should do, to individually to see what's my water footprint, right? Same thing for the farmers. Absolutely. That's only thing is the state mandates that we can't have that data as public records. So that is a big challenge for modelers like me who would love to have handle.
Oh. So in California, in the Central Valley, as everybody knows, the Central Valley is a big agricultural area. They pump in the Central Valley And one of my colleagues, Larry Dale, he actually tried to estimate how much water they were taking out because there was no monitors on the wells. He tried to estimate how much water they're taking out from their power bills,
Yes.
because most of the pumping was electric, not wind.
Yeah.
And so he could get the power bills because that was public record. So he estimated how much they were pumping, and everybody was so angry about
Yes.
just even, getting that information out there. So it really is the case that the water under our feet is the water we don't see. And it's almost like we pretend that it isn't there.
Yeah.
I think that you've said this before, that it almost has a mythical quality, that
Yeah.
we don't see the water. So we think of it as this infinite resource under our feet. And that's one of the reasons it's going one way so fast, is because we don't have any sense of how quickly we're using it. So I love the fact that in the comments, there's been all kinds of great posts about water tracking apps that we can use in our own homes.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to look into this. I think it'd be really cool to get one of these, because I have no sense of how much water we use either. So if there's resources in the chat, if anybody's interested, and Mackenzie also said she's going to be doing some posts on social media about this. But I think we have time for, we have some great resources too. Oh, there's actually a map for the High Plains Water District that Catherine posted if people are interested in looking. And oh yeah, so the High Plains Water District does allow water use estimation from power bills now.
Right.
So
yeah, a lot of places do that now. And that was, that was the way we did it when we didn't have any other metering or other devices. But hinges on having electricity. If it's a windmill driven or we just don't have an idea. So
you have no idea then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have time for 2 more questions. This has been fantastic. The first question, actually, I can answer very briefly, and then the second question is a really good bottom line question for you, Venki. Stuart asked, how does El Nino play into this? And so that's what I do. So I do everything like from the atmosphere down to the ground, and Venki does everything from the ground down below. So El Nino plays into it because it affects our rainfall patterns. When we have an El Nino winter, our winter and spring is wetter than average here in West Texas. And across most of the south central US, when we have a La Nina, our winter and spring is drier than average. And so we go into the growing season with a lot less groundwater and a lot less soil moisture than we would otherwise. And so that varies over a number of years, 3 to 5 years on average. And if anybody's curious, we're actually potentially looking at heading into a weak La Nina right now, which would mean that our next season, not this one right now, but the next season would be a bit drier than average. And that affects groundwater recharge, obviously, because if you have more or less precipitation, it makes a difference. But here's a great question to end with, Venki. And this one comes from Mark. He says, is water too cheap? And if so, what are some policy options to address that problem?
Well, we have if you ask the economists, they'll talk about the diamond water paradox, right? So diamond practically, ladies in the room can excuse me, but very few uses of diamond, but very expensive. A lot of uses for water, but very cheap, right? So that's called the diamond water paradox. In general, we don't pay the full price for water. In most places in Texas, we pay the transportation cost of water. We don't really pay for the water. And is there a way to fix it? That's a very tough question, primarily because there is water for public good. I mean, you cannot make it so expensive that certain people cannot have access to that water. But at the same time, you can't make it so cheap that people will stop conserving water, right? So back in the day, what was happening is that when we build water treatment plants, especially for municipal water use, we over-design because you can't build this every year. So we say, okay, we're going to project it over 30 years or 50-year lifetime, and then we're going to build that plant. And so when the plant initially was being run, it was run very inefficiently because there are economies of scale. The more closer you run to that 100% efficiency, the more efficient the operation becomes. And so people were giving volume discounts. They were saying, you use more water, you pay cheaper price, and that has changed. So now there is tiered pricing. And if you see at Lubbock, I think they give you the first few thousand gallons for free, a very small rate, and then they stagger it up. So that type of tiered pricing has come into play to partly address that question. But it's still, water is not priced where it should be. And if we price water at where it should be, we have to change a lot of things in our economy to make it work. Like, because your food prices go up, every other price goes up. Like, so are we willing to pay the money for all that, for all those resources? And what does it do to some of the geopolitical situations that are there, and your import exports, global challenges? So it's a very complicated issue on a macroeconomic scale.
Mhm.
But there is movement towards that direction, or at least to partially address that question through staggered pricing. And then I don't think there is any city left in Texas that actually gives discount for large volume use. That was happening 20 years ago. Even 10, 15 years ago, it was happening. And that's, not what should be happening. It's conservation in the opposite direction.
Right. Well, and the most important is, as you started this whole thing off, is the price of beer would go up.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Thank you to everybody who attended. This was recorded. It will be posted online. Our July Science by the Glass will feature John Zach talking about how climate change affects national parks, especially Big Bend National Park here in Texas. And thank you again to Venki for doing this. This was fantastic.
Thank you, Catherine, for the opportunity. It was wonderful. Thank you all for listening and thinking about groundwater.